So when you hear the word Sparta, what's the first thing that really leaps to mind? For most people, I think.
It's almost always the same image, right?
Exactly. The 300, the Battle of Thermopylae,
Mm.
this idea of absolute peak discipline.
Red capes, incredible toughness, the sort of pinnacle of the ancient warrior ethic.
Yeah, a legendary, almost superhuman quality.
That image, that myth, is incredibly powerful. But today, we're taking a deep dive, not into the battles themselves, but into the blueprint, into the uh, dark, clinical, and often horrifying reality of how those warriors were actually manufactured.
Right, because the Spartan war machine wasn't built on inspirational mottos or, voluntary discipline.
Not at all. It was built on one of history's most systematic, cold-blooded, and comprehensive experiments in social engineering.
And what we found in the sources is just, well, it's truly shocking. The creation of that perfect Spartan warrior didn't begin when a boy was handed a spear at age 7.
No, it started long, long before that.
It started potentially even before conception in controlled bedrooms, and it intensified the absolute second an infant drew its first breath. I mean, we are looking at a system of total state control over human reproduction, over early life, over psychological development.
And what's so fascinating here is getting to the core objective. The Spartans weren't just aiming to train, competent soldiers. That was just the outcome.
So what was the real goal?
Their overarching goal was to completely eliminate every single human bond that could possibly compete with loyalty to the state.
Every bond. You mean like...
Everything.
Right.
Love, family loyalty, maternal instinct, pity, anything that might make a person hesitate. They sought to erase the concept of a private emotional life entirely.
Turning citizens into purely functional units of the state.
Precisely.
That's a profound, almost terrifying mission statement. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our deep dive today is going to analyze Sparta's methods as, really, history's first large-scale sustained attempt at human optimization through reproductive and psychological control.
It really is a blueprint, and it's so systematic, so cold in its application, that it reads like the plot of a dark dystopian novel.
They functionally treated human beings like highly specialized livestock, bred for a single deadly purpose.
And if we look at the process chronologically, that manufacturing process starts not in the military barracks or the training fields, but with the architects of the society itself, right in phase 1, genetic control and reproductive protocol.
I find this initial phase absolutely chilling because it just removes all pretense of personal choice. As a young Spartan, you were an asset of the state, and your marriage was not a romantic decision.
It was an administrative decision, period.
Made by whom?
By committees of bureaucrats, primarily the magistrates and the gerontes, the council of elders.
And the gerontes were?
Who, exactly? These were the powerful few, men over the age of 60 who had survived the entire brutal system, the Agoge, decades of warfare. They were the ultimate arbiters of Spartan law and destiny.
So they're the ones deciding who marries whom.
Yes, and they tracked lineage with the precision of a modern scientist tracking a pedigree. For the men, the criteria were completely utilitarian.
Proven combat ability.
That's it. How did the father and the grandfather perform in battle? Was the bloodline consistently successful? That was the only measure of a man's worth, because that guaranteed the strength of the future citizen.
And for the women, I imagine it was just as clinical.
Just as specific, but focused exclusively on their biological capacity to produce high-quality offspring. The elders weren't looking for beauty in our conventional sense.
They were looking for biological markers.
Exactly. They prioritized wide hips, which suggested an easier childbirth and higher survival rates for the infant. They required an athletic build, indicating general health and vigor, which they believed would be passed down.
And didn't the sources also mention things like fair skin and symmetrical features?
They did, which is quite chilling. In ancient Greek thought, those were often interpreted as external markers of internal genetic fitness, a lack of hidden defects.
So these weren't aesthetic preferences. They were cold, calculated optimization markers.
Purely for maximizing reproductive output and minimizing the chance of what they saw as a defect.
So the magistrates make their decision, the couple is informed, and that's that. The idea of courtship, or even a basic getting-to-know-you period, just didn't exist.
Not at all. And the wedding ceremony itself was designed, quite deliberately, to actively sabotage any potential for emotional attachment, to prevent a deep personal bond from forming.
The ritual itself sounds bizarre, like a piece of dark theater.
It does. It began with a staged abduction or kidnapping of the bride. She was then stripped, had her head shaved completely.
Shaved? Why?
To strip her of her feminine identity. And then she was dressed not in a bridal gown, but in men's clothing. It was symbolic. Her identity was shifting immediately to a functional state-serving role.
And the groom's part in this.
The groom, who was required to live in the barracks until he was 30, had to sneak away under the cover of darkness.
Wait, he didn't even live with her after they were married.
No, not for years. He would consummate the marriage in complete darkness quickly, and then he had to return to his barracks before dawn. If he was caught, he was punished.
Why this elaborate, almost secretive protocol? What's the logic there?
The Spartans understood that familiarity breeds attachment, and attachment breeds competing loyalties.
A loyalty to a wife or a family over the state.
Exactly. If a man barely knew his wife, if he only saw her in these brief, furtive encounters shrouded in darkness, she would remain a functional partner, a vessel for the state's children, not a source of emotional distraction.
They calculated that a man who has no profound emotional connection will march to his death without reservation.
That soft anchor of the home as they saw it was systematically eliminated from the equation.
Okay, so they've meticulously arranged marriages based on genetics and then actively suppressed emotional bonds. But the state's control didn't stop there, did it? How did they legally justify breaking what we'd consider the most basic social contract marriage vows for state necessity?
This is where it gets really, really interesting. The system went far beyond mere arranged marriage. They formalized the breach of the marriage contract.
How so?
They had a formal, state-sanctioned breeding protocol, a program of eugenics conducted completely out in the open.
Let's walk through a scenario based on the sources. Imagine a man, a highly decorated warrior, proven in countless battles. A huge asset to Sparta.
Right, a prime specimen.
But his wife, chosen by the elders, has either failed to conceive after years, or the children she has produced were weak and didn't pass the initial inspection.
Okay. And meanwhile, across the city, there's another woman. She's from an excellent bloodline, healthy, known to produce strong children, but she's married to a man who perhaps is older or less distinguished in battle.
In any other Greek city-state, that would be scandalous. Adultery was shameful, often punished severely.
But in Sparta, it was a cold, pragmatic adjustment. The state would arrange for the superior warrior to sleep with the other man's wife. Openly. Sometimes it was even encouraged by the magistrates. It wasn't considered adultery in the moral sense we understand. It was simply a logical, pragmatic adjustment to the breeding protocol to maximize the quality of the next generation of soldiers.
And the original husband, whose wife was essentially borrowed, he would just accept this.
He was expected to consent. Often he would even approve of the arrangement. Because a strong child, regardless of the biological paternity, brought strength and honor to his household, and more importantly, to Sparta.
The implications of that are just enormous.
It completely obliterates the traditional concept of paternity and fidelity. Paternity became uncertain, fidelity became irrelevant. The children belonged not to the biological parents, but utterly and completely to the state.
This was a strategic move then. They deliberately weakened the family unit.
Absolutely. The Spartans knew family loyalty could compete with state loyalty, and they couldn't risk it. By decentralizing and collectivizing parenthood, they ensured the state remained the sole, unchallenged focus of devotion.
So if you survived this whole reproductive protocol, you were considered genetically approved. But the moment of birth just ushered in the next challenge, phase 2, quality control.
And birth in Sparta, as you mentioned, was not a moment of celebration. It was the beginning of a relentless clinical evaluation.
The instant the infant emerged and took its first breath, it was taken away immediately.
The mother wasn't allowed to hold the child or bond with it. This was to prevent the formation of that crucial, tender maternal bond that could later interfere with the state's demands.
So the infant was taken. Where?
Not to a loving family. It was taken to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders.
Can you just picture that scene? A newborn baby brought before these men, the oldest, hardest, most battle-scarred survivors in the entire city.
Men who have committed acts of war, watched friends die, and lived under the severest discipline their entire lives. And they examine this naked newborn with absolute clinical detachment.
What were they looking for?
Everything. They checked every limb, the spine, the size of the head, the vigor of the cry. They were looking for any perceived weakness, any deformity, any sign of fragility.
And the logic behind this,
Yeah.
it's rooted in fear, isn't it?
It's rooted in profound existential fear. And this is crucial to understanding the whole system. Sparta was a small, elite population, the homoi, the equals, who were constantly on the knife edge of annihilation.
Because they were vastly outnumbered by the elite.
Vastly why? Some estimates suggest a ratio of 10 to 1. The Helots were the enslaved Greek population who worked the land and hated their masters with an intense passion.
So every single Spartan citizen had to be not just good, but a pillar of strength.
A weak individual wasn't just a drain on resources, they were a profound liability, a crack in the wall, a vulnerability that external enemies, or more dangerously, the Helots, could exploit.
In their minds, weakness had to be ruthlessly eliminated at the source.
And they didn't perceive this as cruelty. It was a cold, necessary function of collective survival.
So what happened if the verdict was negative? If the elders deemed the infant unfit?
The process was chillingly systematic and bureaucratic. The child was carried out of the city to Mount Taygetus, to a chasm known as the Apothétai.
Which translates to what?
Literally, the deposits, or the place of casting out.
The deposits, that language.
Yeah,
It strips away any sense of emotional weight, any humanity.
that was the point. And the child wasn't granted a merciful death. It was simply left to abandonment, exposed to the bitter cold, the elements, wild animals. A slow, agonizing death.
This was literally considered quality control.
Returning defective material to nature, a necessary sacrifice for the strength of the collective.
Now, I know some modern scholars debate how routine this was.
Yes, there's debate on whether this happened to every weak infant or was maybe reserved for infants with extreme, obvious deformities, but the ideological point is undeniable.
That Spartan children had to earn the right to live.
Exactly. By passing this initial pitiless inspection, that fundamental principle that the state dictates who lives and who dies for the collective good shaped the psyche of every single Spartan who survived.
Surviving that judgment was just the first hurdle. For the next 7 years, you were raised at home, but even then, your parents were trained to see you as state property on a temporary loan.
Mothers were taught to suppress all tenderness. The sources even tell us they would bathe infants in wine, believing that fragile children would react badly and prove their weakness immediately.
So they were accelerating their removal.
They were training resilience or weeding out the lack of it from day one.
And then, at age 7, the state comes to collect its investment. We transition fully into phase 3, the Agoge.
A simple Greek word that just means upbringing or leading, but it vastly understates the process.
Which was really a systematic program of psychological and physical dehumanization that lasted until age 30.
At 7, children were violently separated from home, often ripped from their mother's arms.
And the mothers, who had been conditioned their whole lives for this moment, they handed them over without protest.
They were told that to weep or to fight for their child would mark the mother as weak, selfish, and insufficiently devoted to Sparta. The transition was abrupt and total.
From that moment on, the military facility was their home.
Until they were 30, they were assigned to a bosha, which is like a herd or a company. They slept on beds of reeds. They had to gather themselves from the river, often breaking them with their bare hands.
And they wore a single, thin tunic all year round.
The same garment. Scorching summer, freezing winter. The entire system aimed to harden them, to make physical discomfort so routine it just became background noise.
But the physical conditioning went even deeper with state-mandated deliberate starvation.
Yes, the food rations were not just meager, they were intentionally insufficient. This was explicit state policy.
Why would you starve your most valuable assets?
Because hungry children are motivated children. They're resourceful, and the Agoge taught them precisely how to solve that hunger problem.
Through structured, required theft.
That's right. Instructors expected and demanded that the boys supplement their rations by sneaking into the city, infiltrating homes and farms, and taking food without being detected.
So it cultivated necessary military skills: stealth, cunning, reconnaissance.
The ability to operate alone behind enemy lines. All vital skills for a special forces unit.
But here's the profound psychological twist, the thing that reveals the truly dark architecture of the system.
If you were caught stealing, you were savagely beaten, whipped. But the sources are clear. You were not punished for the theft itself.
You were punished for getting caught.
For incompetence. The crime wasn't about the morality of the action taking another citizen's property. The crime was a failure to execute the theft with sufficient skill.
So this instilled a critical, amoral mindset. Morality became about success and failure.
Victory justifies everything. Rules are only for those who are too weak or too slow to get around them. It was the cultivation of an apex predator mentality, where the means justified the end, and the only sin was being discovered.
The most famous story that encapsulates this principle is the fox anecdote.
A perfect illustration. A young Spartan boy steals a live fox kit and hides it under his cloak. When he's questioned by his instructors, maybe about other missing food, The fox starts viciously biting and tearing into his internal organs.
And rather than admit the theft, rather than show he had failed to conceal his crime,
He stood there, answering questions calmly, allowing the fox to literally disembowel him until he collapsed and died.
and the Spartans told that story not with horror, but with fierce, unbridled pride.
This boy, they said, died rather than admit failure or show weakness. This is the ideal they were creating. A human for whom enduring excruciating pain was preferable to showing vulnerability. Lying, stealing, killing. These were virtues if they served the state's interest and were executed perfectly.
But physical hardship and forced immorality were just the introductory lessons. The real process of dehumanization was psychological warfare, focusing intensely on verbal discipline, which leads us to the laconic identity.
Indeed. Our modern word laconic, meaning using very few words, comes directly from Laconia, the region around Sparta,
Spartan boys were trained to weaponize language.
to treat every word as a resource. Ammunition that should never be wasted on sentimentality or superfluous detail.
The instructors subjected them to a constant barrage of questions designed to be traps.
Difficult, tricky, often philosophical questions. Who is the bravest citizen in Sparta right now? Is a quick death preferable to long suffering? There were often no right answers, only opportunities for missteps.
And the goal wasn't intellectual stimulation.
No, the goal was to find the moment of uncertainty. If a boy stammered, hesitated, or gave a verbose, unclear reply, the punishment was immediate.
What kind of punishment?
Often a sharp, immediate pain, the instructor biting the boy's thumb, or a sharp whipping. It was designed to instantly drive home the lesson. Think before you speak. Every single word must be precise, calculated, and necessary.
This created a culture of extreme verbal economy, which is illustrated so beautifully by that famous exchange with Philip of Macedon.
When Philip sent a message threatening, "If I invade Laconia, I will destroy Sparta,"
The collective Spartan reply was just one word: if.
that's not just wit. That is the product of a childhood where every unnecessary syllable could result in immediate physical pain.
And this terror wasn't just inflicted by adult instructors. The real, daily, grinding psychological terror came from the boys slightly older than themselves.
The Irines. These were older teens, maybe 18 to 20 years old, who had absolute, unchecked authority over the younger boys. They were drill sergeants, wardens, and torturers all rolled into one.
And they could inflict arbitrary punishments, make up rules on the fly with no appeal.
Meals became sessions of brutal interrogation. The Irines would fire rapid-fire questions at the younger boys, not seeking information but seeking failure. Any slow response, any perceived sign of weakness, triggered immediate public humiliation and violence.
So this was institutionalized, sanctioned psychological warfare.
Designed to condition the boys to function flawlessly under extreme, unpredictable stress. They learned to think clearly when exhausted and frightened. And crucially, they learned to identify and exploit weakness in others, while simultaneously suppressing every single sign of vulnerability in themselves.
The result must have been profound paranoia, hypervigilance.
You couldn't trust your immediate peers. Trust was weakness. Vulnerability was suicide. You might fight beside the boy next to you in battle decades later, but today, he was looking for any excuse to hurt you or drag you down to elevate his own standing.
So they created men who were socially sophisticated, in a way,
Capable of reading subtle cues and deploying cutting, precise rhetoric.
but who were fundamentally emotionally stunted, incapable of forming genuine, trusting human bonds.
And this psychological conditioning all culminated in the annual ritual known as the Baptism of Blood, the festival at the altar of Artemis Orthia.
Artemis in Sparta was worshipped as Orthia, a harsh, primal deity associated with wilderness, survival, and pain.
The ritual centered around a block of cheese placed on her altar, which the boys had to retrieve. But to reach it, they had to run through a gauntlet of older boys and priests wielding real leather whips that tore flesh.
And the goal was not to avoid the whips.
That was impossible. The explicit goal was to endure the pain without reaction. No screaming, no crying, no flinching.
The greatest honor was to stand there, being whipped again and again, with a calm, even smiling expression on your face.
Ancient sources claim that boys sometimes died under the lash, still refusing to show pain. Whether every instance is literally true or hyperbolic propaganda, the function of the ritual is crystal clear.
It was the final exam.
It was proof that the Agoge had successfully burned away the normal, instinctive human response to suffering. Pain no longer triggered retreat. It triggered an unnatural pride and resilience.
By the time they reached their late teens, they were physically hardened, psychologically conditioned, and morally recalibrated. But the state had one final, darkest test.
An ongoing requirement for the most ruthless of the graduates, the institutionalized terror of the Cryptia.
To understand the Cryptia, you have to always remember Sparta's core reality, its fundamental paranoia.
They were a tiny, precious elite ruling over the massive Helot population. The Helots weren't just slaves, they were conquered Greeks who remembered their freedom and outnumbered their masters by a ratio that guaranteed constant existential dread.
That intense fear of a massive Helot revolt shaped the entire society. Every aspect of the training, the discipline, it was all aimed at maintaining control.
And the instrument of that control was the Cryptia. It's often called the secret police, but it's more accurately an institutionalized instrument of domestic terrorism.
The most ruthless, cunning, and cold-blooded graduates of the Agoge, the ones who excelled at stealth and amoral calculation, were selected for this.
They were sent into the countryside alone, with nothing but a dagger and minimal rations. They were required to hide during the day and move only at night.
And their mission was chillingly precise.
Kill Helots. But not just any Helots. Their orders were to target the strongest, the smartest, the proudest, anyone showing leadership potential, anyone who looked like they might be organizing resistance. The mandate was literally to cut down the tall poppies.
To ensure the slave population remained leaderless, demoralized, and broken by fear.
This was the ultimate psychological final exam for the young Spartan. Could you kill a man who had done absolutely nothing to you, an unarmed man, in darkness, not out of rage or self-defense, but solely out of cold strategic calculation for the state?
If you could suppress every human instinct, empathy, fairness, mercy, you proved you were the perfect, untroubled tool for Sparta.
And to provide legal cover for this systematic murder, to make sure the young men were committing an act of the state rather than simple murder.
The highest magistrates, the E4s, performed a bureaucratic ritual every single year.
They formally declared war on the entire Helot population.
Think about the weight of that administrative paperwork.
A declaration of war meant that every Helot ceased being a slave under Spartan law and instantly became an enemy combatant. Killing them was no longer murder. It was a legitimate act of war. They created a legal fiction to permit organized, institutionalized atrocity,
transforming mass murder into a clean administrative task for the state's elite.
The young men who returned from the Cryptia had proven they could kill because the state ordered it. It was the final, complete stage of their dehumanization. They had, in the words of some sources, blood on their hands, but nothing in their hearts.
Once a man survived the Cryptia and reached age 30, he was finally granted the concession of living with his wife. But his duty wasn't over.
No, the state needed more weapons, and he was expected to continue manufacturing them. Which brings us to the strange position of Spartan women, the optimized incubators.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, Spartan women present one of the most fascinating historical contradictions. On the surface, they had freedoms denied to women almost anywhere else in the Greek world, especially Athens.
Absolutely. They were generally educated, learned to read and write, they managed and owned property, often significant amounts of it since the men were always away.
And they underwent rigorous physical conditioning, running, wrestling, javelin throwing. Athenian women were kept in seclusion. Spartan women were visibly athletic.
But the core analysis, and the part that brings us back to the horror, is that these freedoms were not granted for personal fulfillment or gender equality in any modern sense.
They were granted solely to optimize their biological function.
Precisely. They were being fed and trained to be the perfect incubator for warrior sons. The state had calculated correctly that a healthy, strong, and mentally vigorous mother would produce a stronger child capable of surviving the Agoge.
So investing in women's health was just investing in the state's military strength.
It was efficient, logical, and deeply functionally dehumanizing.
And these women internalized this ideology completely. They were taught from girlhood that their worth, their honor, their survival was measured entirely by the quality of soldiers they produced.
They were trained to suppress that innate maternal instinct of protection and replace it with fanatical patriotic fervor.
This fervor is what produced the stories we still read today. The famous command to their sons, "Come back with your shield or on it."
Meaning, either return victorious or return dead, carried on your shield. Never return in dishonor. That was the moral baseline they insisted upon.
The anecdotes about Spartan mothers are just shocking. There are stories, whether they're literal truth or successful propaganda, of mothers who allegedly killed their own sons for fleeing a battle.
Or the famous story of the mother who, when told all 5 of her sons had died defending the city, responded only by asking, Did we win?
The fact that Spartans told these stories with approval, as examples of peak devotion, not with horror or pity, confirms the system's success.
It confirms they successfully substituted maternal love for state loyalty. These women viewed their children as state resources first and individuals a distant second.
So when a man and a woman, both hardened by this system, were finally brought together to establish a household, the result was a military contract, not a domestic home.
The woman's duty just intensified upon pregnancy. She was carrying state property whose birth would be immediately followed by a clinical judgment.
She was expected to accept the possibility of her child being deposited on Mount Taygetus without question.
Because a true Spartan mother prioritized the strength of the collective over the weakness of her own child. This social architecture of detachment ensured that the emotional cost of war, the death of a son, would not destabilize the state.
The cost was simply factored into the price of survival.
And for 3 centuries, a remarkable span of time, this machine functioned with terrifying, almost unimaginable efficiency. Sparta achieved military supremacy, defeated Athens, dominated the Greek world. The system worked in the short term.
But the intense specialization built fatal existential flaws into its very design. Which leads us to Section 7. The machine consumes itself.
The first and most catastrophic flaw was demographic extinction. Every single dead Spartan warrior was irreplaceable.
Think about the scale of that investment. 30 years of selection, inspection, and the most brutal conditioning program ever devised. You can't just conscript a replacement.
Exactly. Every death in battle was the permanent loss of a product from a 3-decade-long, highly selective production pipeline. Wars, even victorious wars, became ruinously costly.
Thermopylae is legendary, but it was the permanent, immediate loss of 300 of their finest men. Men who would never reproduce, never pass on their carefully selected genetics.
And so the population of full Spartan citizens, the homoia, declined inexorably. From perhaps 8,000 at its peak, the number plummeted to fewer than 1,000 by the time of their collapse.
They were literally breeding themselves into extinction.
Through the very specialization the system was designed to enforce.
The second flaw was tactical rigidity. The Agoge was designed to produce phenomenal hoplites, unbeatable soldiers in the dense phalanx formation, but the system was designed to eliminate independent thought.
It produced conformists, not strategic thinkers. Creativity, questioning, novel solutions. These were not just discouraged, they were brutally punished. The system rewarded those who executed existing doctrine perfectly.
So if you asked, why don't we try using more cavalry? You'd likely be beaten for demonstrating doubt in the Spartan way.
So as warfare evolved around them, as other Greek generals started experimenting with light infantry, siege engineering, flexible tactics, Sparta remained locked into their traditional methods.
They were the perfect answer to a specific military question that was slowly going out of fashion.
The third flaw was the cruelest irony of all. Success poisoned them. After they defeated Athens, vast wealth flowed into Sparta gold, silver tribute,
which directly violated the ancient laws of their founder, Lycurgus, who supposedly banned precious metals to enforce strict austerity.
But once money entered the system, the foundation just crumbled. Land, which is meant to be equally distributed, became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Wealthy Spartans emerged, creating massive economic inequality in a society built on the concept of the equals.
The necessary equality of suffering dissolved. Citizens who couldn't afford the mandatory contributions to the communal mess halls lost their citizenship,
shrinking the homoioi population even further. The discipline that defined Sparta quickly began to relax.
And then came the military catastrophe that shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE.
Their opponent was Thebes, a city they had always dismissed, led by a man named Epaminondas, a true tactical genius.
Spartan phalanx doctrine was absolutely rigid, an even distribution of 8 to 12 men deep across the entire line.
Epaminondas, who had studied Spartan rigidity, knew exactly how to exploit it. He implemented a revolutionary tactic called the oblique order.
Instead of distributing his forces evenly, he deliberately weakened his right flank and stacked his left flank, an astonishing 50 men deep.
This massive column of concentrated weight was aimed like a battering ram directly at the Spartan king and their elite royal guard on the opposing right flank. He was betting everything on Spartan rigidity.
Knowing they would refuse to break formation or adapt?
And he was correct. That Theban column smashed into the Spartan right flank like a sledgehammer hitting glass.
The result was apocalyptic. The highly disciplined formation shattered, the king died, the elite guard died. 400 full Spartan citizens died in a single afternoon.
For a city-state that likely had only around 1,500 citizens left, that was an extinction-level event.
It didn't just kill men, it killed the myth of Spartan invincibility.
That was their entire identity, the sole justification for their brutality. At Leuctra, that identity died. They had no reserves, their population was too depleted, and their mystique was permanently damaged.
And the ultimate irony of their collapse is what happened centuries later. By the time Rome dominated the Mediterranean, Sparta had become a tourist attraction.
A morbid tourist attraction. Romans would actually pay to visit and watch the ritual whipping at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the same sacred test of courage. Now just a bizarre performance of exotic brutality staged for foreign spectators.
The perfect machine had turned itself into a living museum of its own self-destruction.
So we come to the conclusion. The machine, which was built to last forever through perfect discipline, lasted only 3 centuries before consuming itself from within. They had systematically and ruthlessly eliminated what they saw as weaknesses: compassion, individuality, love, fear, moral reasoning.
But in eliminating those human flaws, they eliminated the very things that allow a civilization to adapt, to innovate, and to survive sudden change.
They eliminated the flexibility that produces creative strategic thinking and the emotional bonds that make people care about the collective future beyond their own lifespan.
They created the perfect warrior, the most specialized killing machine ever produced. But in doing so, they created a society fundamentally incapable of being anything other than warriors.
And when the warrior age passed, when clever tactics defeated brute toughness, Sparta had no answer, because they had punished creativity for 300 years.
The lesson is profound. Perfection is a trap. The pursuit of human optimization, of creating ideal specimens and eliminating every perceived weakness, it seems logical, even appealing in its efficiency.
But our messy emotions, our irrational attachments, our stubborn individuality, these are not simply bugs in the human operating system, they are features. They allow for the social cohesion, adaptation, and intellectual flexibility required for civilization to weather unforeseen storms.
Sparta tried to perfect humanity and instead profoundly dehumanized it, creating a flawless weapon that ultimately ran out of ammunition.
They achieved military supremacy for a few generations by destroying everything that makes life worth living. A society where mothers couldn't grieve for their dead children and neighbors murdered each other under legal cover. And in the end, even the perfect warriors they created weren't enough to save them.
This raises a really important question for us, I think. The entire Spartan experiment required forfeiting your humanity to achieve success.
If a system demands that kind of ultimate cost, if you must eliminate love, creativity, and empathy just to win, is that success sustainable? That is the dark truth behind the legend of the 300, and a chilling warning about the ultimate cost of chasing perfection.